Daniel Kofi had everything most men only dreamed about. At 42, he was one of the most powerful politicians in the city. His face appeared on giant billboards beside smiling children. His name was printed on campaign posters across busy streets. Everywhere he went, people shouted his name. Daniel Kofi, our next governor. Daniel would smile, raise his hand, and wave. He had learned how to look humble. He had learned how to shake hands, how to hug poor children for cameras, and how to speak about hunger while standing beside a table filled with expensive food. But there was one thing Daniel had forgotten. He had forgotten what hunger felt like. That morning, Daniel stood inside the huge bedroom of his luxury home, looking through the glass window at the city below. His house sat on a hill, far away from the crowded neighborhoods where thousands of families lived in small rooms with broken roofs. A servant placed his breakfast on the table. Fresh bread, eggs, fruit, coffee imported from another country. Daniel barely looked at it. His phone kept ringing. His campaign manager, Victor Mensa, had already called 3 times. Daniel finally answered. "Sir, the schedule has changed," Victor said. "We need to leave in 20 minutes. "Where?" "The East Market community." Daniel sighed. "That place again." "Yes, sir. We need photographs there. The campaign team wants you speaking with market women and young people." Daniel looked at his expensive watch. "Fine." He ended the call. For a moment, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. Perfect suit. Perfect tie. Perfect smile. He looked like a man who had never experienced failure. But behind that polished face was a growing emptiness. Daniel wanted to become governor. Not because he dreamed of changing the city. At least, not anymore. He wanted the power. He wanted the respect. He wanted his name remembered. By noon, his convoy entered the East Market community. 3 black SUVs moved slowly through the crowded streets. People immediately recognized him. Children ran behind the vehicles. Women waved from their stalls. Young men shouted his name. Daniel stepped out and smiled. Cameras appeared. His advisors surrounded him. "Shake her hand." "Smile here." "Stand beside the children." "Look toward the camera." Daniel followed every instruction. A group of unemployed young men stood nearby. Their clothes were worn. Their faces were tired. Yet when Daniel approached them, they forced smiles. Daniel shook their hands. One young man quietly told him that he had been searching for work for almost 2 years. Daniel nodded. He promised that his administration would create thousands of jobs. The cameras captured the moment. Everyone applauded. But as Daniel walked away, he noticed something that the cameras did not capture. A mother was secretly dividing one small piece of bread between 3 children. An old man sat beside an empty food stall, staring at the ground. A young woman counted a few coins in her palm before putting them back into her pocket. Daniel slowed down. For the first time that day, he looked beyond the cameras. The people were smiling, but many of them were hurting. His campaign manager touched his shoulder. "Sir, we need to move." Daniel nodded. He followed him. Then suddenly, a loud horn sounded. A truck had stopped directly across the narrow road. Daniel's convoy could not move. The driver tried to reverse. Another vehicle blocked the way. Within seconds, the entire convoy was trapped. Daniel looked around. The polished world he knew was gone. There were no quiet roads, no security gates, no private elevators, no comfortable distance. Only crowded streets, shouting vendors, dusty sidewalks, hungry children, and struggling families. His advisor whispered nervously, "Sir, we'll get you out." Daniel looked through the window. For the first time in years, he was surrounded by the people he claimed to represent. And he had no way to escape. He did not yet know it, but somewhere in that crowded street was a man who would soon change the way Daniel saw power, money, and himself. A man who owned almost nothing. A street barber. And before the day ended, Daniel Kofi would meet him. The convoy had been trapped for almost 15 minutes. Daniel sat inside the SUV, tapping his fingers against the leather armrest. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. His campaign manager, Victor, leaned toward the window. "Sir, the driver says the road should clear soon." Daniel looked outside. It had not cleared. Instead, the crowd had grown larger. Then Daniel noticed something unusual. Across the street, beneath a faded blue umbrella, a man was cutting someone's hair. The barber stall was tiny. One old chair. One cracked mirror. A small wooden table covered with combs, scissors, shaving cream, and a rusty pair of clippers. Above it hung a hand-painted sign. *** Samuel's Barbershop. Clean cuts. Honest service. ***. Daniel almost smiled. A barbershop in the middle of all this chaos. He watched the barber carefully. The man looked to be in his late 30s. He wore a simple shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Sweat covered his forehead, but his hands moved calmly. He finished the haircut, brushed the man's neck, and collected a few coins. Then another customer sat down. Daniel noticed something else. People were not only coming there for haircuts. A taxi driver stood beside the chair talking about rising fuel prices. A young student complained about school fees. 2 unemployed men argued about a job interview. An elderly woman stopped to ask Samuel for advice. Samuel listened to everyone. He did not rush them. He did not laugh at their problems. He simply listened. Daniel became curious. "Who is that man?" he asked. Victor glanced over. "Just a barber, sir." Daniel looked again. People seemed to know him. Victor shrugged. "It's a small neighborhood. Everyone knows everyone." At that moment, Samuel looked across the street. His eyes met Daniel's. He recognized him immediately. Daniel expected the usual reaction. A smile. A wave. Perhaps a desperate attempt to shake his hand. Instead, Samuel simply nodded. Then he returned to cutting his customer's hair. Daniel frowned. It was strange. Almost everyone wanted something from him. Samuel did not. A few minutes later, the traffic finally began moving. Daniel opened the door of his SUV. "Sir?" Victor asked. "I'll be back." "Back where?" Daniel pointed toward the barber stall. Victor looked shocked. "Sir, the cameras are waiting." "Let them wait." Daniel crossed the street. As he approached, Samuel looked up. "Good afternoon." Daniel nodded. "You know who I am." Samuel smiled slightly. "Everyone knows you." Daniel waited for praise. None came. Samuel simply pointed toward the empty chair. "You can sit if you need a haircut." Daniel glanced at the chair. Then at his expensive suit. "You cut politicians' hair." "I cut anyone who can afford it." Daniel almost laughed. It was the first honest thing someone had said to him all day. He sat down. As Samuel prepared the clippers, Daniel looked at the cracked mirror. "People here seem to trust you," he said. Samuel continued working. "They trust me because I listen." Daniel became quiet. Samuel noticed his expression through the mirror. "You politicians listen too," Samuel added. Daniel smiled. "That's good." "No," Samuel said calmly. "You listen when you want votes." The clippers stopped. Daniel's smile disappeared. Samuel continued cutting. "People don't need another speech," he said. "They need jobs. They need schools that work. They need safe streets. They need food on their tables. Most of all, they need leaders who remember them after Election Day." Daniel stared at himself in the mirror. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Then something unexpected happened. A little boy approached the stall carrying a school uniform that was too large for him. Samuel stopped cutting Daniel's hair. He reached beneath the table and pulled out a pair of school shoes. "Take these," he told the boy. The boy's eyes widened. "But I haven't paid you." Samuel smiled. "You don't have to." The child hugged him. Daniel watched silently. The shoes were old, but they were clean. And they were clearly Samuel's own spare pair. Daniel looked down at his expensive shoes. For some reason, they suddenly felt heavier than before. Samuel returned to the haircut. Daniel said nothing, but the words stayed in his mind. ***, people don't need speeches. They need someone who remembers them. ***. And for the first time, Daniel wondered whether he had become the kind of leader he once promised himself he would never be. Daniel had planned to leave the neighborhood as soon as his haircut was finished. But he stayed. Something about Samuel's little barber stall kept pulling at his attention. The man had almost nothing, yet people kept coming to him. Not just for haircuts. For advice. For help. For hope. A young man came asking about work. An old woman needed medicine. A student needed money for school. Samuel listened to every one of them. Daniel watched from the side. He had seen politicians surrounded by hundreds of people before. But those crowds came because of money, promises, or fear. People came to Samuel because they trusted him. That difference bothered Daniel. After the last customer left, Samuel sat down and wiped the sweat from his face. Daniel looked at the tiny shop. How long have you been doing this? Samuel looked at the clippers in his hand. Almost 20 years. 20. Samuel nodded. I didn't plan to become a barber. Daniel became curious. What did you plan to become? Samuel smiled faintly. A teacher. He looked across the street at a group of children playing near the market. When I was young, I loved school. I wanted to teach children. My father used to tell me that education was the one thing nobody could steal from you. His smile faded. But then my father died. Daniel said nothing. Samuel continued. My mother had no income. I had 2 younger brothers and a sister. Someone had to feed them. So you left school. I had no choice. Samuel picked up his old clippers. I learned barbering from a man nearby. I started with a borrowed chair. Slowly, I built this place. Daniel looked around. This. Samuel smiled. Yes, this. It was more than a barber shop. Daniel was beginning to understand that. Samuel pointed toward the old wooden box beneath the table. Inside were notebooks, pencils, and school uniforms. I help some children with school expenses, he explained. Not because I am rich. Because I know what it feels like to lose your chance. Daniel stared at the box. How do you afford all this? Samuel shrugged. Sometimes I don't. The answer struck Daniel harder than he expected. Samuel had almost nothing. Yet he kept giving. Daniel remembered the expensive dinner planned for his campaign team that evening. One meal would probably cost more than Samuel earned in several months. Before Daniel could say anything, several young men returned to the stall. Samuel began teaching them how to use clippers. Don't hold it like that, he explained. Keep your hand steady. Daniel watched. Samuel was not only cutting hair. He was teaching young men a skill, giving them something they could use to earn money. A few minutes later, Daniel's phone rang. Victor. Sir, where are you? I'm still here. We have a campaign meeting. Daniel looked at Samuel. Fine. I'll come. When Daniel arrived at the campaign office, everything felt different. The room was filled with wealthy businessmen, advisors, expensive suits, and campaign posters. A huge screen displayed Daniel's face. Victor pointed toward a list of promises. Free housing. 5,000 new jobs. A new hospital. 3 new highways. Daniel stared at the list. Can we actually do all this? Victor laughed. Sir, this is politics. People want hope. Daniel remembered Samuel. Asterisk asterisk, people don't need speeches. They need opportunities. Asterisk asterisk. Victor continued. Tomorrow's rally must be massive. We need the crowd excited. Daniel sat silently. For years, he had believed that politics was about winning. But suddenly he wondered what happened after the cheering stopped. What happened after the election? What happened to the promises? What happened to the people who believed him? That night, Daniel returned home and stood before the mirror. His suit was perfect. His house was silent. His campaign posters covered the walls. Yet for the first time, Daniel did not feel powerful. He remembered Samuel's cracked mirror, his old chair, his worn clippers, and the little boy walking away with a pair of second-hand shoes. Daniel slowly looked down at his own expensive shoes. He whispered to himself, "Who am I really helping?" The question frightened him, because deep inside, he already knew the answer. His political career had become more about looking like a servant than actually serving. And somewhere between the barber's chair and the campaign office, the foundation of Daniel Kofi's confidence had begun to crack. That night, Daniel could not sleep. Samuel's words kept returning to him. His old barber chair, the school shoes, the young men learning a trade. The little children waiting for someone to help them. Daniel turned in his expensive bed, but his mind was somewhere else. It was back in the East Market. And then he remembered something he had spent years trying to forget. A file. An old government file. 8 years earlier, before Daniel became one of the city's most powerful politicians, he had been part of a major development project called the East City Renewal Plan ***. The project had promised modern roads, shopping centers, offices, and new housing. Daniel had supported it strongly. At the time, he believed it was necessary. He remembered standing before government officials and saying that progress sometimes required difficult decisions. Hundreds of poor families were removed from their homes. They were promised compensation. They were promised new places to live. But most received very little. Some received nothing. The land was eventually sold to wealthy investors. Luxury buildings rose where small homes had once stood. Daniel became more powerful. The investors became richer. And the families disappeared into crowded neighborhoods. Daniel had convinced himself that he had done the right thing. Until now. The next morning, Daniel secretly asked his assistant to bring him the old project documents. He read them slowly. Then he saw a familiar name. Samuel Mensa. Daniel froze. He read it again. Samuel's name was listed among the families affected by the development project. His hands became cold. No, Daniel whispered. He turned another page. There it was. Samuel's original family home had been demolished. The land had belonged to his father. Daniel stared at the document for several seconds. Suddenly, the barber stall looked different in his memory. The cracked mirror. The old chair. The worn umbrella. Samuel had not simply grown up poor. His family had lost their home because of a decision Daniel had helped support. Daniel pushed the papers away. His heart began racing. What if Samuel knew? What if he remembered Daniel's name? What if he told the people? Daniel imagined headlines. Politician behind the eviction of hundreds. His campaign could collapse. His dream of becoming governor could disappear overnight. He could lose everything. Daniel immediately thought of avoiding Samuel. Maybe he should never return to that neighborhood. Maybe he could send someone to offer Samuel money. Maybe he could make the old documents disappear. But before he could decide, something unexpected happened. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the barber shop. Samuel looked up. He smiled. You came back. Daniel stood silently. Samuel pointed toward the chair. Need another haircut already. Daniel almost laughed, but his throat felt tight. How are you? Samuel shrugged. Same as always. Working. There was no anger in his voice. No accusation. No revenge. Samuel did not know that the man standing before him had helped make his family homeless. Or perhaps he knew. Daniel could not tell. Samuel simply continued working. A customer arrived, and Samuel welcomed him. Daniel watched quietly. The man who had every reason to hate him was treating him with dignity. That hurt more than anger would have. Daniel finally asked, Samuel, do you remember the East City Renewal Project? Samuel's hands stopped for a moment. His face became still. Then he slowly looked at Daniel through the cracked mirror. I remember. Daniel's heart sank. Samuel continued cutting the customer's hair. My family lost our home because of it. Daniel swallowed hard. I see. Samuel looked at him. You sound like you knew that already. Daniel could not answer. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Samuel simply returned to his work. He did not shout. He did not insult Daniel. He did not demand money. And somehow, that silence made Daniel feel smaller than any public attack could have. Daniel walked away from the barber shop with one terrible realization. The man he feared would expose him was not the man who could destroy his career. The truth itself was. And Daniel had spent years running from it. 3 days later, Daniel's perfect political world began to fall apart. It started with a newspaper article. The headline appeared across the city before sunrise. Who really benefited from the East City Renewal Project? Daniel stared at the screen of his phone. His heart dropped. He opened the article. The journalist had uncovered old government records showing that hundreds of families had been removed from their homes. The article named several officials, and among them was Daniel Kofi. For years, Daniel had believed the past was buried. Now it was standing in front of him again. By breakfast, the story was everywhere. Radio stations discussed it. Television hosts questioned it. People on the streets argued about it. And social media was filled with angry comments. Daniel's campaign office became unusually quiet. Victor rushed into the room holding several papers. "Sir, we have a problem." Daniel looked at him. "I know. This is bigger than we expected." Daniel stood beside the window. Below him, reporters were already gathering outside the building. "What do we do?" Victor hesitated. "Control the story." Daniel turned. "What does that mean?" "We can pay some media outlets to stop talking about it. We can also put pressure on the journalist." Daniel said nothing. Another advisor spoke. "And there is the barber." Daniel's face changed. "Samuel." "Yes. He knows what happened. If reporters interview him, he could become the face of this whole story." Victor placed a file on the table. "We should attack his credibility before he speaks." Daniel stared at him. "How?" "Call him an unemployed street barber. Say he is angry because his family lost land. Tell people he is using your name to become famous." Daniel felt a wave of anger. Not at Samuel. At himself. For a moment, he considered it. It would be easy. One press conference. A few paid reporters. A few carefully chosen lies. Samuel could be turned from a respected community member into an angry troublemaker. Daniel could protect his career. Then he remembered the little boy receiving the old-school shoes. He remembered Samuel's cracked mirror. And he remembered those words. ***, people need leaders who remember them after election day. ***. Daniel closed his eyes. "No." Victor stared at him. "No. We are not attacking Samuel." "But sir." "I said no." The room became silent. That afternoon, the journalist arrived at the East Market neighborhood. Her name was Grace Addo. She spoke with former residents. She photographed the remains of old homes. She interviewed people who still remembered the day their houses were destroyed. Then she found Samuel. He told her everything. Not with hatred. Not with exaggeration. Just the truth. He explained how his father had begged officials for more time. How their family had packed their belongings into old bags. How his mother cried when their home was destroyed. How they moved from one rented room to another. And how Samuel eventually became a barber just to keep his family alive. Grace asked him one final question. "Do you hate Daniel Kofi?" Samuel looked down. After a long silence, he shook his head. "Hating him will not bring my home back." His answer spread across the city that evening. Daniel watched the interview alone. For the first time, he saw the damage his decisions had caused through someone else's eyes. Then Victor entered. "The debate is confirmed." Daniel looked up. "When?" "Tomorrow night." Victor's voice became serious. "They are going to ask you about the renewal project." Daniel's stomach tightened. "And Samuel?" "They may ask about him too." Daniel looked at the television. Samuel's face was still on the screen. The man Daniel feared most was not shouting. He was simply telling the truth. Tomorrow, millions of people would be watching. Daniel had two choices. Protect the position he had spent years building, or finally accept responsibility for the truth he had spent years hiding. That night, Daniel stood alone in his office. His campaign posters surrounded him. His smiling face was everywhere. But for the first time, he hated the man in those photographs. Because that man looked like a leader. And Daniel was beginning to understand that he had not truly been one. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to keep pretending, or finally become the man people believed he was. The night before the debate, Daniel did something his security team never expected. He left his house alone. No convoy. No bodyguards. No campaign manager. No cameras. He drove through the dark streets until he reached the East Market neighborhood. Samuel's barber stall was still open. A single yellow bulb hung above the chair. Samuel was sweeping the floor. When he saw Daniel step out of the car, he stopped. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Samuel leaned the broom against the wall. "You came late." Daniel looked at him. "I needed to talk to you." Samuel nodded toward the chair. "Sit." Daniel sat down. The same chair. The same cracked mirror. But tonight, Daniel felt different sitting in it. He looked at his reflection. His eyes were tired. "I don't know what to do," Daniel admitted. Samuel remained quiet. "The debate is tomorrow," Daniel continued. "They are going to ask about the project." Samuel nodded. "They should." Daniel lowered his head. "My advisors want me to deny everything." "I know. They want me to say you are lying." Samuel shook his head. "Will that make what happened disappear?" Daniel looked at him. "No. Then you already know what you should do." Daniel's eyes filled with frustration. "You don't understand. If I tell the truth, I could lose everything." Samuel looked at him carefully. "Maybe." Daniel looked surprised. Samuel continued. "But if you lie again, what will you become?" Daniel had no answer. Samuel walked toward the old mirror. "When you have little money, you learn to notice things rich people don't." He pointed toward the street. "You notice who gives food to a hungry child." He pointed toward the market. "You notice who helps when someone gets sick." Then he looked back at Daniel. "And you notice leaders who only come when cameras are watching." Daniel swallowed hard. Samuel's voice remained calm. "People remember how you make them feel when nobody is watching." Daniel looked down. For years, he had believed power meant controlling people. Samuel was showing him something different. Power could also mean having the courage to serve them. "I could help you," Samuel said. Daniel looked up. "How?" "I could tell the journalist that you were not responsible." Daniel's eyes widened. "You would do that?" "No." Daniel stared at him. Samuel smiled sadly. "I won't lie for you." Daniel nodded slowly. "But I won't destroy you either," Samuel continued. "Why?" "Because revenge won't rebuild my father's house." The words hit Daniel deeply. Samuel stepped closer. "You helped destroy something that belonged to my family. I won't pretend it didn't happen." Daniel's eyes lowered. "But if you truly want to change," Samuel said, "then repair what you helped destroy." Daniel looked at him. "Before asking people to forgive you, give them a reason to believe you are sorry." Silence filled the small stall. Daniel remembered the old documents, the families, the broken homes, the promises that had never been kept. Then he remembered the campaign posters hanging across the city. Tomorrow, he could protect the image. Or he could protect the truth. Daniel slowly stood. "What if I lose the election?" Samuel shrugged. "Then you lose an election." "And my career?" "Maybe." Daniel looked confused. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder. "But if you save your career by destroying your conscience, what have you really won?" Daniel felt tears building in his eyes. For the first time, he understood. Samuel was not trying to become powerful. He was not asking for money. He was not demanding revenge. He simply wanted leaders to stop treating ordinary people like numbers on a campaign poster. Daniel walked toward the door. He stopped. "Samuel." "Yes." "Thank you." Samuel nodded. "Don't thank me yet." Daniel turned. "Why?" "Because tomorrow, you have to tell the truth." Daniel stepped into the dark street. His fear was still there. His future was still uncertain. But something inside him had changed. For years, Daniel had believed that losing power was the greatest thing a politician could fear. Now he understood something worse. Losing himself was. That night, Daniel returned home and looked at the speech his advisors had prepared. He picked it up. Then he tore it in half. He sat at his desk and began writing a new one. For the first time in his political life, Daniel Kofi was not writing words designed to win votes. He was writing the truth. And tomorrow, he would stand before the entire city and accept responsibility for what he had done. The television studio was packed. Bright lights covered the stage. Cameras pointed toward the politicians. Hundreds of people sat in the audience, waiting for the debate to begin. Across the city, millions were watching. Daniel sat quietly at his desk. His opponents looked confident. They had spent the entire morning preparing to attack him. They had documents. They had accusations. They had stories about the East City Renewal Project. Daniel's campaign team sat behind him. Victor leaned forward one last time. "Remember the plan," he whispered. Daniel looked at him. "What plan?" "Deny everything." Daniel slowly shook his head. Victor's face tightened. "Sir, don't do anything foolish." The moderator stepped onto the stage. Tonight, the people deserve answers. The first questions were simple. The economy, unemployment, education, healthcare. Daniel answered carefully. Then came the question everyone had been waiting for. The moderator looked directly at him. "Mr. Kofi, documents show that you supported the East City Renewal Project 8 years ago. Hundreds of families lost their homes. Did you know what was happening?" The entire studio became silent. Daniel looked toward the audience, then toward the cameras. He could feel Victor staring at him. His political opponents were smiling. They expected him to lie. Daniel took a slow breath. "Yes." One word. The room froze. Victor's eyes widened. Daniel continued. "Yes, I supported that project." A wave of shock moved through the audience. He could hear people whispering. Daniel's hands were shaking beneath the desk. But he kept speaking. "At the time, I believed economic development was more important than the cost paid by ordinary families." He paused. "I was wrong." Nobody moved. Daniel looked directly into the camera. "I wanted political success. I wanted influence. I wanted people to see me as a man who could bring development to the city." His voice became quieter. "But I forgot the people who were standing in the way of that development." A reporter in the audience raised his eyebrows. Daniel continued. "Families lost homes. Parents lost land. Children lost the places they called home." He swallowed. "And I was part of the decision that allowed it to happen." Victor stood up behind the cameras. "Stop." But Daniel continued. "I will not blame my advisors." He looked toward his opponents. "I will not blame the previous administration." Then he placed both hands on the table. "I take responsibility." The audience erupted. Some people applauded. Others shouted questions. Daniel waited until the noise settled. "If I am elected, I will establish a transparent compensation program for families affected by the project. I will support housing for those who were displaced. Every payment and every decision will be open for the public to see." His opponent interrupted. "You expect people to believe you now?" Daniel looked at him. "No." The answer surprised everyone. "I don't expect anyone to trust me because of one speech." He paused. "Trust must be earned." The studio became quiet again. "And I want to make something clear," Daniel continued. "I will begin repairing this damage whether I win this election or not." Victor walked out. Several campaign workers followed him. Daniel watched them leave. His political allies were abandoning him. His campaign was collapsing in front of the nation. Yet Daniel felt strangely calm. For the first time, he was not trying to protect his image. He was simply telling the truth. When the debate ended, Daniel walked outside alone. There were no cheering supporters waiting for him. No campaign music. No smiling advisors. Just reporters shouting questions. Daniel kept walking. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Maybe he had destroyed his political career. Maybe he had lost the election. Maybe he had lost everything. But across the city, people were talking. Some called him a fool. Some called him brave. Some said he was only pretending. And in the East Market neighborhood, Samuel sat beneath his old blue umbrella. His barber shop was quiet. A small television rested on the wooden table. Daniel's confession had just ended. Samuel stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he slowly smiled. Not because Daniel had won. Not because his own family had received justice. But because, perhaps for the first time, Daniel had finally stopped pretending. Samuel picked up his clippers. Outside, the streets remained crowded and noisy. But something had changed. A powerful politician had finally spoken like an ordinary man. And for Samuel, that was the beginning of real change. The morning after the debate, Daniel woke up without knowing whether his political career was over. His phone was filled with missed calls. Some were from reporters. Some were from angry supporters. Others were from people he had not heard from in years. But Daniel ignored them. Instead, he put on a simple shirt, left his expensive car behind, and drove to the East Market neighborhood. This time, there were no cameras, no campaign posters, no advisors, just Daniel. He walked through the same streets where he had once arrived, surrounded by black SUVs. An elderly woman recognized him. She looked at him carefully. "You came back." Daniel nodded. "Yes." She studied his face. "Where are the cameras?" Daniel looked around. "There are none." The woman smiled faintly. "Then maybe you really came to listen." Those words stayed with him. Daniel spent the entire day visiting families who had lost their homes. He sat on broken chairs. He listened to mothers. He listened to fathers. He listened to old people who had carried the pain for years. One man showed him a small piece of paper proving that his family had once owned land. Daniel held it carefully. "I should have listened to you years ago," he said. The man looked at him. "You can't change yesterday." Daniel nodded. "But I can change tomorrow." That became Daniel's new promise. He began using his political influence to push for a legal compensation program. He demanded that every affected family be properly identified. He asked for public records. He ordered an independent review of the old project. Some powerful people became angry. Several businessmen warned him to stop. Daniel refused. He had finally learned that leadership was not about making everyone happy. It was about doing what was right when powerful people wanted something else. Then Daniel returned to Samuel's barber stall. "I want to help you," he said. Samuel looked at him. "How?" "I can give you money. We can expand this shop." Samuel shook his head. "No." Daniel was surprised. "No. I don't need charity." Daniel smiled slightly. "Then what do you need?" Samuel pointed toward the young men sitting nearby. "Give them a chance." Daniel listened. "Equipment. Training. Proper tools. Let them learn barbering, mechanics, carpentry, tailoring. Give them skills they can use." Daniel looked at the young men. One of them had been unemployed for years. Another had dropped out of school. Another had been rejected from several jobs. Samuel continued. "Money can feed someone for a week. A skill can feed a family for years." Daniel felt something change inside him. He finally understood the difference between helping people and empowering them. Within months, a small community training program was created. Samuel's barber stall became one of its first training centers. Young people learned practical skills. Some became barbers. Others learned electrical work. Some learned carpentry. Daniel helped secure equipment and training partnerships. But he did not put his name on everything. He no longer needed applause. One evening, Daniel sat outside Samuel's shop. The two men watched several young trainees practice their new skills. Daniel smiled. "Do you remember the first day I came here?" Samuel laughed. "You looked very uncomfortable in that chair." Daniel laughed too. "I was." "You still are." Daniel looked at him. "Maybe that's good." Samuel nodded. Daniel had once believed leadership meant standing above people. Now he understood that leadership meant standing beside them. His friendship with Samuel had started with a traffic jam and a haircut. But it had become something much greater. It had become a lesson in humility. Daniel knew he had not erased his past. He could not rebuild every destroyed home overnight. He could not return the years families had lost. And he could not expect forgiveness simply because he had apologized. Redemption would take time. It would require work. Every day. Every decision. Every person he chose to serve. Daniel looked at the young men learning around him. For the first time in his life, he felt proud without seeing his face on a billboard. The barber had taught him something no political advisor ever could. Power is not about how many people serve you. True power is about how many lives become better because you chose to serve them. Election morning arrived with a strange silence. The city was covered with posters. Daniel's face appeared on some of them. His opponents' faces covered others. But Daniel's campaign looked very different now. The wealthy businessmen who once surrounded him were gone. Several political allies had abandoned him. The expensive campaign events had stopped. There were no huge crowds of paid supporters. Daniel stood in front of his bedroom mirror and adjusted his simple shirt. 4 years, Election Day had been his dream. Today, it felt like a judgment. He arrived at the voting center without a large convoy. People recognized him immediately. Some smiled. Others stared. One elderly man shook his head. "You admitted what you did," he said. Daniel nodded. "Yes." "I don't know if I can forgive you." Daniel looked at him calmly. "You don't have to." The man seemed surprised. Daniel continued. "I made mistakes. You have every right to remember them." He walked away. That was how Daniel faced the election. He did not attack his opponents. He did not deny his past. He did not make new promises just to win votes. Instead, he accepted whatever judgment the people gave him. By afternoon, the voting stations began closing. Daniel returned home. The waiting was painful. His television remained on. News reporters discussed the results. His campaign staff sat quietly around the room. Every few minutes, another result appeared. One district went to his opponent. Another district went to Daniel. Then another. The numbers were close. Very close. Daniel watched the screen without speaking. Victor, who had returned after leaving the campaign, stood near the window. "We still have a chance," he said. Daniel nodded. But he did not allow himself to hope. Hours passed. Then the final major district was announced. The room became completely silent. The news presenter looked into the camera. "Daniel Kofi has won the election by a narrow margin." Nobody moved. Victor looked at Daniel. "We won." Daniel slowly sat down. "We?" Victor smiled. "Yes, sir. We won." Daniel looked at the television. He should have felt like the most powerful man in the city. Instead, he felt something else. Relief, humility, and responsibility. He knew the people had not voted for a perfect man. They had voted for a man they believed might still change. Daniel stood. "No celebration tonight." Victor looked surprised. "But sir." "No expensive party. No fireworks. No champagne." Daniel picked up his jacket. "Where are you going?" Daniel smiled. "To see someone." The next morning, Daniel drove to the East Market. Samuel was opening his barber stall when he saw him. He stopped. "You won." Daniel nodded. "By a little." Samuel smiled. "A little is still a win." Daniel laughed. Then his expression became serious. "I came to thank you." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For telling me the truth when everyone else was telling me what I wanted to hear." Samuel placed his clippers on the table. "I only told you what you needed to hear." Daniel looked around the small shop. "I wouldn't be standing here without you." Samuel shook his head. "Don't give me too much credit." Daniel smiled. "You changed my life." Samuel looked at him for a long moment. Then he pointed toward the barber chair. "Sit down." Daniel laughed. "Again?" "You're governor now. You still need a haircut." Daniel Saturday. As Samuel began cutting his hair, the sound of the clippers filled the little shop. Outside, people were celebrating the election. Inside, Daniel sat quietly. Samuel looked at him through the mirror. Winning an election is easy compared with becoming a good leader. Daniel nodded. "I know." "No," Samuel said. "You don't know yet." Daniel smiled. Samuel continued. "Winning takes one day. Leadership takes every day after that." Daniel looked at his reflection. For the first time, he understood. The election had not given him a reward. It had given him another chance. A chance to prove that his confession had not been empty words. A chance to serve the people he once ignored. A chance to become the leader he had only pretended to be. Samuel finished the haircut and brushed the loose hair from Daniel's shoulders. Daniel stood. "How much?" Samuel smiled. "Same price as before." Daniel laughed. As he walked away, Samuel called after him. "Daniel." He turned. "Don't forget where you learned how to listen." Daniel nodded. I won't. Then he walked toward his waiting car. The city was waiting for its new governor. And this time, Daniel was ready to serve it. Several months passed. The city had begun to notice something different about Governor Daniel Kofi. The changes were not perfect. There were still poor neighborhoods. There were still unemployed young people. There were still families struggling to survive. But slowly, things were beginning to move. New vocational centers opened in communities that had been ignored for years. Young men and women were learning skills. Some trained as electricians. Others learned tailoring, carpentry, mechanics, and barbering. Families who had lost their homes under the old redevelopment project were finally being identified and offered support. For Daniel, every improvement was a reminder of something important. An apology had started his journey. But action was what gave that apology meaning. One Saturday morning, Daniel walked through a newly opened training center. There were no cameras, no reporters. A young woman was learning to repair electrical equipment. Nearby, 2 young men were practicing carpentry. Daniel stopped and watched them. One of them recognized him. "Governor." Daniel smiled. "Yes. Thank you for this." Daniel looked around the room. Then he shook his head. "Don't thank me. Use the opportunity well." The young man smiled. Daniel continued walking. He no longer needed people to clap when he entered a room. The work mattered more. But no matter how busy his new life became, Daniel never forgot the small barber stall where everything had changed. From time to time, he returned to East Market. He would sit beneath Samuel's faded blue umbrella. He would take his place in the old barber chair. And Samuel would cut his hair just as he had before Daniel became governor. One afternoon, as Samuel worked, Daniel looked into the cracked mirror. "Do you know this chair has become famous?" Samuel laughed. "The chair?" "Yes. People say it's where the governor learned humility." Samuel smiled. "Then they should put a warning sign on it." Daniel laughed. But the laughter did not last. Later that week, Daniel faced a decision that brought his past rushing back. A group of wealthy investors wanted permission to build a massive commercial project. The project promised jobs, money, new roads, more tax income. But there was a problem. A poor community stood on the land. Hundreds of families would have to leave their homes. Daniel sat in a meeting with his advisors. "This project could transform the economy," one advisor said. Another nodded. "The investors are powerful. We should approve it." Daniel looked through the documents. Then he asked a question that made the room quiet. "What happens to the families?" One advisor said, "They will be relocated." "Where?" The advisor hesitated. "We haven't decided yet." Daniel slowly closed the file. Years ago, he would have signed the papers. He would have called it progress. He would have convinced himself that sacrifice was necessary. But now he saw the faces behind the numbers. He saw Samuel's father, Samuel's mother, the children who had lost their homes. Daniel stood. "This project will not be approved like this." The advisors exchanged worried looks. "Governor, the investors will not be happy." Daniel looked at them. "Then they can be unhappy." One advisor stepped forward. "This could cost us millions." Daniel's voice became firm. "And what will it cost the families?" Nobody answered. Daniel picked up the documents. "The community will be consulted. Every family will have legal protection. No one will be removed without fair housing, proper compensation, and a clear agreement." The meeting ended in silence. Daniel knew he had just made powerful enemies. But this time, he was not afraid. That evening, he returned to Samuel's barber stall. Samuel was closing for the day. Daniel sat in the familiar chair. "You look tired," Samuel said. "I had a difficult meeting." "Did you listen?" Daniel smiled. "I tried." Samuel nodded. "That is better than most leaders." Daniel looked into the cracked mirror. For a moment, he remembered the man who had first sat in that chair. The man in the expensive suit. The man who wanted power. The man who believed leadership meant being admired. That man felt like a stranger now. Samuel finished the haircut. Daniel stood and reached for his wallet. Samuel stopped him. "Not today." Daniel smiled. "You're giving the governor a free haircut." Samuel shook his head. No. I'm giving my friend a reminder. Daniel looked at him. A reminder of what? Samuel pointed toward the busy street. That those people are the reason your office exists. Daniel's smile faded into a thoughtful expression. He nodded slowly. I know. Samuel watched as Daniel walked toward his car. There were no campaign posters now. No crowds chanting his name. No cameras following him. Just a man walking away from a small barber stall. But Samuel knew something had changed. Daniel had entered this neighborhood believing he was powerful. He had looked at a poor street barber and seen an ordinary man. But he had left with a lesson that changed his life. True leadership did not begin with power. It began with listening. A person's importance was not measured by the size of their office, the amount of money in their bank account, or the title printed before their name. It was measured by the lives they chose to improve. Samuel never became a politician. He never owned a large house. He never became rich or famous. But from beneath a faded blue umbrella, with a cracked mirror and an old barber chair, he changed the heart of one of the most powerful men in the city. And in the end, that simple act of honesty changed far more lives than either of them could have imagined.